Konnichiwa. Today we're going to talk about organic Japanese. That is, about the revolution in acquiring Japanese. Seeing Japanese through the eyes of Japanese. And not just that, but seeing the world through the eyes of Japanese while we're based in Japanese. That is, while we're using Japanese. So we might call this becoming Japanese linguistically. This is a radical idea that has only become possible very recently. So what is organic Japanese? This is my 100th video here on YouTube. So we're going to bring the whole thing together here and look at the overall strategy of organic Japanese and how you can use it to become as near as possible to being linguistically native in Japanese. Organic Japanese has two elements, two fundamental strands. You may know that I have two main series here on YouTube. One is about structure and one is about immersion. And some people may think that these are just two things that I talk about that aren't especially related, except that they're both about Japanese. But this could not be further from the truth. The two are in fact symbiotically, organically related. One makes the other possible. You can use my fundamental structural approach without immersion, and it'll help you with whatever it is you're trying to do because you'll understand how Japanese really fits together. It really isn't possible to use organic immersion without structure, and that's why organic immersion hasn't been possible up to now. And I'll explain why that is in just a moment. First of all, let's very briefly go over the idea of structure. What do I mean by structure? Is this just another word for what most people call grammar? Well, insofar as it's talking about how the Japanese language holds together, yes, it is. I call it structure because what gets called grammar in grammar books and websites, even the best of them, is not the real structure of Japanese. In fact, it's worse than not being the real structure. It actually undermines your ability to grasp the real structure. How did that happen? How did that come about? Well, a couple of 100 years ago, when people first started bringing the Japanese language to the West, explaining it in Western languages, particularly English, they used the tools they had at the time, and they were the tools of European grammar. And they didn't fit Japanese, but if you're very good at European grammar, if you've had a classical education in Latin and Greek the way these people had, you can get away with that. It's a bit like chopping a tree down with a sword. If you're really good at using a sword, you might get away with doing that, even though it's a lot less efficient than using an axe. But when you then give a sword to people who've never even handled one before and told them that that's the tool for chopping a tree down, you're not doing them any favors. And the teaching of Japanese in English really hasn't progressed at all since those very early days. They still use European concepts that have no relevance to Japanese whatever, such as conjugation, and they still give phrasebook type translations, such as kohi ga suki da means I like coffee, which, as I've demonstrated, is worse than unhelpful. It actually undermines any intuitive grasp we might have got of how the language really works, because it's total misinformation. Japanese is in fact a wonderfully logical, beautiful, crystalline language. It's very different from European languages. Part of the reason that Japanese is presented as an irrational mess is because Western people looking at the Japanese language assumed that languages are an irrational mess, because European languages, including English, are an irrational mess. But Japanese isn't. Japanese is completely different. Japanese is an amazing logical structure with almost no serious exceptions. I don't think it would be possible to use the true organic approach in many languages other than Japanese. Japanese is very special in that respect. It's close to the archetype of what language really ought to be. But if you approach it as if it were really just a European language in disguise, you've handicapped yourself from the beginning, and that's what conventional English language, Japanese so-called grammar, does. So this is the first strand, grasping Japanese as it really is, seeing how it actually works. And this gives us the basis for doing everything else, because even though structure is important, learning structure is not learning Japanese. You can't learn Japanese in the abstract. You can only acquire the language through being immersed in the language. Now, immersion isn't a new thing. People have gone to other countries where only one language is spoken, and they've picked up that language through complete immersion. That's almost as old as language itself. But when we talk about digital immersion, when we talk about using the techniques and opportunities for immersion that become available because of technical innovations of the last few decades, the means of immersion boil down to fundamentally two types, and both of them are deeply flawed. We have either blind immersion or indirect immersion. But if we can understand the structure, we can use a third kind of immersion, which is what I call direct, organic immersion. So the two flawed kinds are, first of all, blind immersion. That's immersing in material without knowing what it means, hoping to pick it up by osmosis or by paying very, very close attention to the material and trying to work out what's going on. Now, this may work for some people, but I believe that for most people, this is a very, very, very difficult way to learn and usually ends in failure. The other form of immersion is indirect immersion, and this is done through things like sentences in Anki. First of all, with English translations, and then one's supposed to move on to using only Japanese translations. Now, if you don't have structure, and if you don't use the European grammar models, or you don't use them very heavily, you're pretty much dependent on this indirect immersion for picking up any structure at all. But the problem with it is that it is indirect immersion. It's not actually immersing in Japanese material. It's just using dead sentences on a slab. And this isn't what language consists of. The reason that immersion is so important is, to take an example of vocabulary, dictionaries cannot teach us words. What they do is introduce words to us. Suppose we see Sakura for the first time, and somebody introduces her and says, "This is Sakura. She's a mouse trainer from Ichinomiya." We don't know Sakura from this introduction. We only get to know Sakura by meeting her in various places at various times and actually getting to know her as a person. And words are the same. Words have nuances and connotations that are built up over hundreds of years, and everybody who uses those words natively has all kinds of emotional connections with them, from songs, from conversations, from books. And those connotations may differ slightly from individual to individual, but fundamentally they are culturally deep connotations, which will be much the same for everybody, provided they've had exposure to those words in various situations and contexts. This doesn't work with chopped off sentences. This needs entire contexts. So, how does structure help us with this? In the first place, the reason that most immersionist methods use these sentence cards is that they need them to assimilate structure. Now, this means that a lot of their immersion has to be indirect through SRS sentences. This has another effect, which is that you can't learn kanji through SRS sentences because there are too many other cues to the meaning beyond the appearance of the kanji itself. This means that you have to have a whole other branch of study called learning kanji, which is usually done through something like Heisig. We don't have to do that. We learn kanji as part of our vocabulary. This means that we have a much less heavy reliance on SRS, Anki, study-based activities. Most of our Japanese time goes into real immersion, direct immersion, in actual Japanese material for Japanese people. We don't even learn all our vocabulary from Anki. When people say to me, I know so many thousand Japanese words, I always think, you're going about it in a very unnecessarily labor-intensive way. We use Anki for learning kanji and for pinning words in place when they actually need to be pinned in place. An awful lot of our vocabulary gets reinforced by our background audio immersion in comprehensible Japanese audio, at first in the form of the soundtracks from the anime that we've already been through with Japanese subtitles. This means that we hear the vocabulary over and over again, and we assimilate quite a bit of it. So the number of Japanese words that we know is considerably higher than the word count in our Anki or our SRS. And this is natural, because if you ask a Japanese person, how many Japanese words do you know? She's not going to know. If I ask you, how many English words do you know? You're not going to know. Treating language as a natural thing, we don't know how many words we know. We just pick them up as we go along in the course of our life. And that is the whole point of organic Japanese. We learn Japanese in the course of our Japanese life because we can understand the structure, because we can see Japanese through Japanese eyes, not through English spectacles, because we can see how it really holds together, what it's really doing. We're able to discard this study-centered model of learning Japanese and this SRS-centered model of learning Japanese, and indeed really drop the idea of learning Japanese altogether. We no longer think about studying Japanese, practicing Japanese. We think about living Japanese. And that's made possible in the first place by having the structure. If you don't have the structure, you have to do all kinds of things to make up for the fact that you don't have structure, which turn it all into a very artificial exercise. And a lot of people like this artificial exercise. A lot of people see Japanese as a skill or an achievement. They want to be the very best, like no one ever was. Well, we want that too, but we don't see Japanese as the vehicle to being the very best, like no one ever was. We just see it as the thing we need in order to play Pokemon in the first place. Because if we're becoming linguistically Japanese, then in the areas of our life which we've turned into Japanese territory, there's only one language, and that's Japanese. So if we want to play games, or watch anime, or read manga, then we need Japanese as the means to doing that. For us, Japanese isn't a skill. It isn't an achievement. It's language. It's the fundamental means of communication. And that's what it means to become linguistically Japanese. If you have any questions or comments, please put them in the comments below, and I will answer as usual. I'd like to thank my Gold Kokeshi patrons, and all my patrons and supporters on Patreon and everywhere. And I'd like to thank you for attending this lesson. これからもよろしくお願いします。Class dismissed.